Can you tell us about how the Indian Americans views Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US next month?
The excitement's an all-time high. Certainly, speaking from not only a California perspective, but frankly, talking to people all across the United States, I think there's just a tremendous amount of excitement. I think one of the reasons is that the United States has phrased the U.S.-India partnership as probably the most consequential of the 21st century. And the new role of India playing as being a leader of the global South, along with this position of leadership in a multipolar world, is creating this opportunity where I think the U.S.-India partnership is seen as a partnership of equals. So there's a great excitement, whether it's high tech, whether it's community in general, or this admiration for the stature that India is getting in the United States. So I believe there's an excitement. I know my father, who's 90 years old, is very excited that the Prime Minister will be coming to the United States. And I think that's just overall a spirit of happiness, excitement about the trip.
What role do you think Indian Americans can play in building this relationship?
I think that the relationship can only be consequential when there's people to people. Governments and bureaucracies will meet. The bilateral, the trilateral, the conversations with the Secretary of State, Defense, Energy, and Commerce is going to happen. But I think that the people of the United States and the people of India, it's a people-to-people interaction across a gamut of issues, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's high tech, whether it's conversations about the environment. These interactions are perpetual, they're ongoing. It's what strengthens that. As Americans living in this country, often enough, the idea of the India that we bring to the table, it's something in our hearts. Even though our interests are now so intertwined as American citizens, what's good for America is what has to be good in this relationship. We can help sensitize bureaucrats, we can help sensitize elected officials to the nuances of the relationship. At the same time, we can also be critical when the relationship is not going right. So that's really where that part about the people to people becomes so vital. I've often heard the Secretary of State and every agency that comes back from a visit to India applauds the people to people. Ongoing, every day, monthly, weekly, and the interaction that happen is what strengthens it. And their doubts, those are cleared. So I'm a big believer in the people to people.
What are the key issues that the two leaders should put in a priority list when they meet next month?
Well, I think that the conversation, certainly from the United States side, is going to be a foreign policy that's based on human rights. That's first and foremost what foreign policy conversations begin with, no matter what ally comes to the United States. But I think on technology, the geopolitical considerations are probably the low-hanging fruits. I think ISET, the Critical Emerging Technologies that was signed by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and the India counterpart, was based upon that. I think from a technology standpoint and the geopolitical considerations of this multipolar world in which India is edged with China and the hegemony that is dealing with it, caught in this context of the Ukraine-Russia war, I think puts India in a pivotal position as a strong ally in the region. So I think technology is certainly one for that. Representative of the New South, and India brings that voice to the table compared to the China debt trap, I think is the remarkable opportunity. I would say cyber terrorism, the new conventional wars, is going to require a new bi-dimensional relationship. In politics, as they say, that there are no permanent friends and enemies, they're just permanent priorities. I'm a believer that India is the country that can no longer be left to fend on its own. And I believe that it's at a pivotal point in time, not only because I think the diplomacy has been very nuanced, but I think India's economic front has created a situation where American corporations are now excited. If the rumors are true about GE allowing the engines to be built in India, it would be unprecedented. I think that is coming of age of a relationship. And I believe that's the strengthening of the relationship, which will go a long way in ensuring that this formidable relationship is not only done for America's Indian interests, but for the good of the world, in which China's hegemony is certainly something everybody wants to put a check on.
Where do you see India has made progress in last 9 years under the Prime Ministers of Mr. Modi?
It's a great question. And I think that for those that observe what Prime Minister Modi has done, I think Prime Minister Modi has clearly recognized that while there are domestic challenges that he has to face, the global diplomacy has certainly taken on a life of its own. I think he's been able to build successful relationships that have forged from somebody who they believe has the best interest of India at heart. I think he has also recognized that India's economic strength puts him in a pivotal position to sit at a table of equals. It is not something that people do not mention. It will be the third largest economy in the world. When that happens, there's certainly an economic interest from corporations that look to India as a right place to come back and grow and prosper from. But I think that they've been able to come back and forge those relationships, whether it's Quad or as a select committee, and China just came back with the NATO plus six. I think they've clearly positioned themselves that India will have to have multiple relationships across a multipolar world. And I think that for too long, Europe has always had its way. And I think Europe used to always think that the world's problems were not their own, but their problems were the world's problems. I think India has now come back and said, every problem is our problem. How we deal with it is significant. And by giving a voice to the New South, I think it's clearly perpetuated not only India's role, but India's role as a voice of the South, and then comes along with the Quad looking at the Indo-Pacific as a key and a vital region. So I think on that regard, whether it's Prime Minister Modi or Foreign Minister Jaishankar, they've clearly pivoted a role where they're unapologetic about their decisions, but clearly talk about the world being sensitized to the challenges India faces in a region where they've been at loggerheads with the border.
So
So from
all
that regard, I think they've done well.
so all these steps, do you think, is making India a global leader?
I think they aspire to be a global leader. I think many people are not understanding the nuances. And often enough, there's always this belief that India is lecturing to the world. But I think India does have to sometimes put its perspective on the table. I think America recognizes the position that India is. And I understand that they think that India has to amplify the concerns because, as you know, it's a world of coalitions, right? Whether it's a question about China and Russia, and India being centered in that position, being able to come back and dovetail a foreign policy of its own, recognizing the threats that it faces from a strong China today, hopefully won't be as strong in the future, and that's really where these coalitions are being formed. But it is that perception, and I think the United States recognizes that India has to be given a little bit of freedom to do what they need to do. Maybe freedom's not the right word, but it's an acceptance that India has its own realities. But having said that, I think the US-India partnership is vital. It can't be one-sided. It has to be both sides agreeing to the challenges they face and how do they deal with them.
Does China brings the two countries together?
I think the threat of China's threat to the world brings a lot of people together. I think that the very nature of the U.S.-India partnership is one that has been built upon the last 5-6 years. It wasn't always like this. I've always been a believer that the United States foreign policy was looked at through the prism of an AFPAC strategy. With the United States out of Afghanistan, I think it's no longer looked at through an AFPAC perspective. It is now looked at a perspective of India's place in the geopolitical, frankly, the Pacific Ocean, and how the Quad represents that from an economic to a potential technology and a political equation and potential expansion of the Quad in the future. You know, the NATO on one side, Quad on the other side, clearly creates an opportunities for fair democracies to put a check on those that aspire to cause hurt in this world.
As Prime Minister Modi prepares to make his important trip to the US, do you have any message for him on behalf of Indian Americans?
I would say that continue to be, you know, India's potential is a beautiful potential. I think the world recognizes that. I think that when you are a statesman of that type, you continue to recognize that a partnership with America is probably a vital partnership. When it comes to the challenges that India faces, I do believe that America will be a more reliable ally for a variety of reasons. I also recognize that his humility is what the world has always admired about. And I think that certainly believe in the potential of India. We as Indian Americans living in this country have been strengthened by our beliefs of what we brought to this nation. America is one of the greatest nations in the world. And if I had to pick sides, I'd come back and be on the sides of the United States because we will always stand by our allies and friends when the going gets tough.